Whether you've just started teaching or spent decades in the classroom, you know there's always more to learn. But where do you start? Well, here at Hillsdale College, we have the answer for you. Tried and True, a primer on sound pedagogy by Hillsdale College professor Daniel Coupland. In this little book, you'll read lessons from more than 25 years of Dr. Coupland's classroom experience. It's all distilled into 14 easy-to-read chapters on lesson planning, assignments, and classroom management, and it will help you improve your skills and inspire you as a teacher, one of our most important professions. Whether you've been in front of the classroom for years, or this is your first year, when you read Tried and True, you'll find something to help you keep improving every single day. You don't need to go at it alone. Let Dr. Coupland's real-world experience encourage you and inspire you. You can get your copy today at hillsdale.edu/true. That's hillsdale.edu/TRUE. Thanks for listening.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We continue our series of episodes from presentations delivered at the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence Seminar on the Art of Teaching Children's Literature. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence is an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office. It offers seminars in classical academics and pedagogy for teachers nationwide of any background. Seminars are led by the faculty, leadership, and master teachers of Hillsdale College. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series of events on the art of teaching. On February 29th and March 1st of 2024 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, it's the Art of Teaching, the Sciences. And April 11th and 12th in Ann Arbor, it's the Art of Teaching, American History. To learn more and register, please visit the webpage for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence at k12.hillsdale.edu. Check the Events tab and look for Hoogland Center. Or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. In September 2023, Dr. Dan Coupland, Dean of the Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education and Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, spoke on the formative power of children's literature. In this portion of his lecture, he uses an anecdote from his son's childhood to frame the power of stories and images to form the moral imagination.
Ultimately, I'm going to be trying to give an answer for why do we read literature? And there's lots of different answers to that question. I'm going to try to key in on one in particular. And I'm going to do it by getting a little bit personal, at least in terms of the Coupland family. So some of you may have heard this story before. I used to try to do it without using my son's name. And then I would get into the story and I would realize I would use my son's name. He is now 22 and he is married, and people now come up to him and say, "You're that Quinn." So let me just dispense with all of the formality and just tell you, my son's name is Quinn. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story to help you understand the ideas that I'm going to try to communicate, because it really helped me to understand the idea of the formative power of literature. So as I said, my son is 22 right now, but when he was 7 years old and my daughter Reagan was 5 years old, they were typical kids. And my wife and I try to be careful. We don't want to be helicopter parents and swoop in anytime there's a conflict. We think it's good parenting to allow our children to try to negotiate things and to figure out things on their own. But as all of you parents know, and most of you teachers know, there's a line that kids cross where it requires a teacher, an adult, a parent to swoop in and to help solve problems. So there was one episode, I was down the hall in our house. I could hear my two kids out in the living room, and they were They were conversing, for lack of a better term, but there was a significant amount of teasing going on. And I thought, well, we'll just allow that to go for a little bit while. And my son Quinn made a comment, and I thought, whoa, that's really close to the line. Then another comment after, that's over the line. So I got up, walked down the hallway, and I said, okay, that's enough. Quinn, you need to go down to your room. We need to have a conversation. So he went down to his room, and I remained in the living room kitchen area there, and I pondered, as all good parents should do, thought, what am I going to say to Quinn as a 7-year-old? And so I started to lay out my ideas in my mind, and I was formulating them into an argument. And I had informally, in my own mind, titled it On the Nature of Teasing. I had already I decided that I would start with the weaker evidence and slowly, go to the stronger with some rising action to my argument. So I walked down the hall. I don't think I had a swagger when I walked, just kind of a confident walk. And I walked into my son's room. He's there, seated on the bed, and I sat across from him, and I looked him in the eye, and I said, son, and I began on my argument on the nature of teasing. And I don't want to brag, but it was brilliant. And I went from point A to point B to point C. We just heard, those of you who were in here, about lyric poetry. It was lyric, just my logical argument. It was sound, it was profound. I could hear angels singing in the background. It was beautiful. And then I looked down at my son, and he looked like this. And I thought, what a waste on such a brilliant argument on this right here. Now, I have to compliment him. At least he was looking at me, or he was trying to pay attention. But I realized that my argument had not hit home. In a moment of divine providence, and actually out of desperation, I said, Quinn, you're being an Edmund. Now, let me explain for those of you who don't recognize the name Edmund. We had just been reading as a family the Chronicles of Narnia. Specifically, and I'm willing to go and have the argument with you after about which book you start with. I argue for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I see some of you applauding quietly, so I don't have to have that argument. We had just completed that. Now, let me just tell you, for those of you who don't know the Chronicles of Narnia, it's mainly about the 4 Pevensey children, at least the early books are. Let me introduce them to you very quickly. This is Lucy here. This is Susan. This is Peter. We'll get to him a little bit later. And this is Edmund. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Edmund if you haven't read the stories yourself. Edmund, here he is again, makes a deal with the White Witch. Edmund, out of the 4 children, although all 4 are flawed in some way, as good characters are, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Edmund makes some terrible choices. He's a liar, he's a cheat, he's actually a traitor, he's willing to betray his family in order to get Turkish delight and hot chocolate, right? So let me tell you, when I said, Quinn, you're being an Edmund, this is his reaction. He went, immediately. To be candid with you, I myself was stunned. That one word and that one name hit Quinn, a 7-year-old, with such force that he would actually respond with no words whatsoever, just an expulsion of like that. And he looked down at the ground. So this, for me, actually began a quest, as it were, to try to figure out and to solidify in my mind what on earth went on in that particular episode and similar episodes that I had discovered. So I'm going to actually walk you through the journey that I had and the people who have actually helped to cultivate my understanding of why Quinn reacted the way he did, and then we'll get back to Quinn a little bit later on. So I'm actually going to read you from some minds and from some people and from authors who have helped to form my own mind. Around the same time that this episode happened, I was actually reading this book called Redeeming the Time by a man named Russell Kirk. Some of you have heard of Russell Kirk. Actually, one of the books that you received, Tending the Heart of Virtue by Vigen Guroian, Kirk had a big influence on Guroian. So when you read Guroian, you're actually hearing a lot of Kirk in the background. Russell Kirk actually taught at Hillsdale College as well for a short period of time. But this is what he said. He said, "What then is the end, object, or purpose of humane letters?" Now, literature is involved in humane letters, but he says, why the expression of the moral imagination? Or to put the truth in a more familiar phrase, the end of great books is ethical, to teach us what it means to be genuinely human. That's the purpose of humane letters in general. That's the humane in humane letters, but literature in particular as well. So this was the first time I had heard the phrase moral imagination. I should have heard it a long time ago, but from Kirk's writing, this was the first time I had heard of moral imagination. Kirk says that he heard about it from a man named Edmund Burke in an essay titled Reflections on the Revolution in France. And there's a line from this essay that is really powerful. In fact, I'm going to be talking about images and the images that literature provides for us. But he has this image, Burke, in his own text. He refers to it as the wardrobe, immediately an image, right? The wardrobe of a moral imagination. So again, I'd heard of morality, I had heard of imagination, but I'd never made the connection between the two. So this was the question in my mind. How then does the imagination lead to morality? Well, it didn't take long for me to stumble upon a book that you received at this conference. In fact, it's in its second edition. And in fact, Eric read my first quote from this passage. And this is what it says. I'll read it to you again, because Eric read it to you this morning, but let me read it to you again. It's not the entire passage that he read, but it says this: mere instruction in morality is not sufficient to nurture its virtues. Now, I just want to stop for a second. I want to go back. Mere instruction, delivering the rules, providing an airtight logical argument, commandments. Now, notice what he says there. Mere instruction in morality is not sufficient. He didn't say it was a waste of time. In fact, sometimes we need airtight arguments. Sometimes we need a list of rules. Sometimes we need commandments. I don't know, 10 of them perhaps? Sometimes we need it, but what he says is it's not sufficient. In other words, it has to be something in addition to that mere instruction. He goes on, it might even backfire, especially if the presentation is heavily exhortative or heavy-handed, and the pupil's will is coerced. Instead, a compelling vision of the goodness itself needs to be presented in a way that's attractive and stirs the imagination. A good moral education addresses both the cognitive, the head, and the affective, the heart, or Lewis might say the chest, dimensions of human nature. Notice that it's a both and, not an either or. One is not sufficient. Let me introduce you to another author. William Kilpatrick wrote a phenomenal book called Books That Build Character. Actually, the book is around 300 pages long or so. The text itself is about 60 pages, and then 240 pages of lists of quality books to read. Annotated, by the way. So it's a really good resource if you're interested in children's literature. This is what Kilpatrick and his co-authors say about the imagination. Imagination is one of the keys to virtue. It is not enough to know what's right. There's the head, right? It is also necessary to desire to do right. Notice knowing and desiring are two different things. Desire, in turn, is directed to a large extent by the imagination. In theory, reason should guide our moral choices. We need to stop here and to say we have an obligation to teach students to think carefully, to think critically, to think logically. But that's not enough. But in practice, it's the imagination much more than reason that calls the shots. Too often, our reason obediently submits to what our imagination has already decided. Imagination plays a critical role in the moral decisions that children make, that adults make as well. Newman said a very similar thing, much more succinctly. He said this: the heart is commonly reached not through the reason, but through the imagination, by means of direct impressions, by the testimony of facts and events, by history, by description. So then what is the moral imagination? Well, I'm going to rely on, in fact, if you look at Tried and True, you'll see that book is actually dedicated to the mentors in my life. If you've read the story, if you've read the introduction, you know that I probably wouldn't have made it to year 2 if it wouldn't have been for the French teacher down the hall, right? She saved my teaching career. So I list out these mentors, and one of the mentors that I list there is actually my predecessor at Hillsdale College, John Fennell. And I had the privilege of spending many years under his leadership there at Hillsdale College. He wrote a lovely essay called "What is the Moral Imagination?" So that's probably a good place to go if he's going to pose that question. Here's what he said: the moral imagination is a store of images. We could put, rather than store, we could say a wardrobe of images. The idea of a wardrobe, and we put things on a hanger in that wardrobe. The moral imagination is a store of images pertaining to ideas, principles, meanings, and possibilities, in terms of which one grasps the world and thereby in which one acts. But the way one acts is a synonym for character. So if you're an educator, you're constantly hearing about character education. Thus, the building of the moral imagination is the formation of character, and to the degree that parents and teachers systematically involve themselves in this activity, they are engaged in character education. The moral imagination and the cultivation of the moral imagination is at the core of cultivating character in our children and also in our students. In the book you received by Vigen Guroian, he says it this way. He says, the moral imagination is not a thing, not even so much a faculty as the very process by which the self makes metaphors out of images given by experience. Let me translate that for you. Experience, our daily lives. It could be reading a story. It could be reading a poem. It could be the conversation you had in the coffee line. It could be the podcast you listened to earlier in the day. All of these experiences come to us and we make metaphors out of them. And then he says this, and then employs these metaphors to find and suppose moral correspondences in experience. In other words, we have these metaphors in our mind, and then when we go and we live our lives, we use those metaphors to be able to interpret what's going on and then also to give a response to what we experience in the world. And then there's this ominous statement. And this is humbling as a teacher, but also as a parent especially. He says this: the richness or the poverty of the moral imagination depends upon the richness or the poverty of experience. In other words, what our students experience, what our children experience, they're going to draw on those images from our wardrobe and make moral choices in the world. Stories are incredibly powerful. informing students' moral imagination. And before I get into a poet or her encouraging to us, I wanted to point out a really interesting book by a guy named Dan Willingham. He is a cognitive psychologist from the University of Virginia. He's written a column for about 10 to 15 years called Ask the Cognitive Psychologist. And what he does is this. He's a researcher, well-published, but he knows that what's going on in his field has an implication or has an impact on what's going on in the classroom. And so he acts almost as a translator. Like, I'll go read the research and I'll provide you answers to the questions you may have. It's a phenomenal book. I would highly recommend it. It's actually in the second edition now. But he's not a literature professor. He's a cognitive psychologist. He studies the mind and how the mind works. And here's what he says in his book. He says, the human mind seems exquisitely tuned to understand and remember stories. So much so that psychologists sometimes refer to stories as psychologically privileged. Isn't that an interesting image in our mind? Again, he's just looking at the mind and how we think. And he says that stories have a power. They're psychologically privileged. They're given a higher position in our minds. Let's look at Dickinson's poem very quickly. This is what she says in the poem, There is no frigate like a book. Here's what she says. There is no frigate, which is like a ship or a boat. There is no frigate like a book that takes us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. How's that for alliteration? What she's talking about there is the idea of transport, right? That in the pages of a book, we can go to different places. We can also go to different times as well. She goes on, this traverse may the poorest take without a press of toll. It's almost embarrassing how inexpensive the greatest stories of all time are today. And then she says this, how frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul. Notice that she is even identifying that it's not just the idea of transport. It's not just cool to go over to 12th century China, right? But actually through the pages of a book, I think what she's talking about here is story, right? That those stories carry humanity, right? The author is showing some and providing some of his own humanity, and through those stories, our humanity is actually shaped. I'll return here to Russell Kirk. Fiction is truer than fact, he says. I mean that in great fiction, we obtain the distilled wisdom of men of genius, understanding of human nature that we could attain, if at all, unaided by books, only at the end of life after numberless painful experiences. We don't have to go through painful experiences. We can learn from the experiences of others. He goes on, scientific truth, or what is popularly taken as scientific truth, alters from year to year with accelerating speed in our day. But poetic and moral truth change little with the elapse of the centuries. To the unalterable in human existence, human literature is a trustworthy guide. That's pretty good. Alistair McIntyre says the same, or a really similar thing. Man in his actions and practice are essentially a storytelling animal. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is, and what the cast of characters may be in the drama into which they have been born, and what the ways of the world are. And then he says this, again, a warning, deprive children of stories and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in the actions in their own world. Hence, there is no way to give an understanding of any society, including our own, except through a stock of stories, except for a wardrobe of stories or a wardrobe of images. In Tending the Heart of Virtue, Goroyan says a similar thing. Great fairy tales and fantasy stories capture the meaning of morality through vivid depictions of the struggle between good and evil, where characters must make difficult choices between right and wrong. Heroes and villains contest for the very fate of imaginary worlds. The great stories avoid didacticism, preachiness, right? And supply the imagination with important symbolic information about the shape of the world and our appropriate responses to its inhabitants. One more, and then I'm going to give you an example. This is a great text by Stratford Caldecott called Beauty in the Word. He says this, and I'm showing you the text just so you'll keep track of them. The Velveteen Rabbit, The Little Mermaid, The Wind in the Willows, The Snow Queen, Beauty and the Beast, and The Chronicles of Narnia reveal an aspect of what it is to be truly human, not in a moralistic way by spelling out the rules and the regulations of right behavior, but in a way that educates the imagination of the readers to see patterns of linking characters, decisions, and events in the real world. It is not a way of just communicating the rules. Isn't that interesting? He also is connecting the ideas that it's just not about rules, but showing how the rules work and perhaps even why they work. However fantastic, however unreal the landscapes in which these stories unfold, however untrue to life they may be in the factual sense, they are true in a deeper meaning of the word, in that they reflect the way things really are. They open our eyes to look not just merely at the surface of things, but also at their forms.
That was Dr. Dan Coupland, Dean of the Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education and Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, at a portion of his lecture, The Formative Power of Children's Literature. Remember, you can learn from Dr. Coupland and many other Hillsdale College professors at online.hillsdale.edu through Hillsdale's online courses. One of more than 30 courses available is Dr. Coupland's Classic Children's Literature. Look for it at online.hillsdale.edu. To learn more and register for the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, go to k12.hillsdale.edu, click the Events tab, and look for Hoogland Center, or write to cte@hillsdale.edu. I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.